What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how we're actively designing a predictive chaos shield, how we're actively doing this, and also fragments of what we're actively implementing this in today's build. So with the mission of these videos to show our builds raw and real, what it is that we're doing, the wins, the losses, the good, the bad, the ugly, to build out better mental models into the future, and also just to scale those mental models, and also just to build big problems within businesses and organizations, and also to call in visionaries, basically people that understand what our mission is, and also to connect with cool people building cool things at the same time. So how I'm designing this predictive chaos shield is in 5 simple steps, like always, with number 1 being why prediction beats reaction, and fixing chaos after it hits 10x more than stopping it cold is much better than being able to say, hey, we are able to fix this by reaction over prediction. So prediction is actually much better than reaction in my own personal view. So if we can predict for it, we can stop it before it snowballs, and this is why we're actively just implementing this predictive chaos shield. Also just building the mental models around it, so saying, hey, predictions, your superpower. So basically using data in order to tie down what it is that we're building, to say, hey, because of these specific metrics that we picked up from last month's saying your KPIs are XYZ, we can predict that if you're falling short of your KPIs in terms of revenues or just numbers within your sales calls that you're supposed to have, we can just basically design a build around that ultimately just allows us to basically predict before reaction, which is always, in my opinion, just better to be able to predict it than react when it doesn't happen. And saying, hey, how I'm actively doing this is mapping 3+ planners meltdowns, vendor no-shows, overbookings in Airtable to spot triggers. So basically just planning and mapping this out, and which is the first step to basically figuring this out, which is basically mapping. Because if you're able to map out what it is that is actively going around in the business today and in the past as well, you can ultimately use those as guide and also data, with also building feedback loops in order to create how you're building the solution so that you can scale it up into the future, but also be able to predict. So what it is that we're actively trying to implement in today's build, what we're actively doing is just using data as feedback to say, hey, we have data, and this is the data that we've gotten from the past, this is what's going on in today, and this is how we're going to build our predictive modeling and just actively implement features that ultimately allow us to then build this predictive analysis tool that we're actively building. And the biggest lesson here that I've learned is history's your crystal ball, so make sure to use it. So saying, hey, you're not going to just guess off of random numbers, you're actively just going to use the history within the businesses of what they have done in the past and also the present, so that you can use it as a guide into the future. And asking the first principles question of what's the root signal that chaos is coming, to say, hey, if we're not hitting XYZ, then this is a signal that chaos may be coming. If it's a core data point within the business, so we say, hey, what is the core data point within this specific business, and then we ultimately just say hey, we need to make sure that we understand this core data point, because it anchors so many things else around it that ultimately allow us to build this predictive analysis tool that we can then use to make measurements and judgments into the future, but also just making sure that the accuracy in which we're building for is super accurate. Because the number one thing is you don't want to have lossy data or data that is not accurate, inaccurate data, because that is going to ultimately give you a wrong perception of what to do into the future, and you don't want that, especially with what we're building. So we're just actively asking, how can we use the data that we're using and also just find a commonality, or just find a point where we can say, hey, this data is accurate based on XYZ, and just cross-referencing it all the time. And probably right now as I'm speaking, I just came up with an idea to probably just add a data auto tracker to just basically auto track if the data is accurate based on specific anchor points, so that we don't always have to manually just input it. I think that's something that we're actively going to integrate into. I'm just going to take a further look into it. And then which ultimately brings us to point number 2, which is collecting predictive data, which is super important. Saying, hey, you can't predict without inputs. Data is your radar. Like I've been saying in the beginning, using data ultimately allows you to have this radar view, or this overarching landscape view, that ultimately just just allows you to understand what it is that you need to be taking in terms of actions and also scaling those actions. But you're not going to be able to do that without, number one, feedback and also data. So data from feedback from data, and then just being able to move with that through space and time, basically saying you should be able to move through that in terms of what it is that you're building, and then ultimately saying, hey, I'm doing this is track vendor response times and client revisions in Airtable to say, hey, we're actively trying to cover this data by gathering data as well in terms of client revisions that we have, what it is that we're revising, and also just tracking the response times, how long this response time, so that we can ultimately understand an average on how long it takes for us to get feedback, so that we can ultimately just plan better and build better as well. And found 48 delays signal trouble, so saying, hey, if someone responds in 2 days, that ultimately leads us to work a lot slower, and momentum is our drive. So ultimately just getting that response time into quicker, just quickening the response time, and then ultimately just using this data as guide, which is the biggest lesson that I've learned here, to ultimately just use data to guide what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, because data ultimately just allows you to build that predictiveness that ultimately allows you to then also cater. If you say, hey, we are building this predictive analysis machine, but ultimately also predicting and having leeway or room for adjustments if you need to, because things may pop up, but you ultimately just need to also have that view of what is the worst case scenario if things aren't accurate, and if things aren't going well, what can you do in the meantime. And also just asking the question, first principles question of what's the simplest data point that predicts your next breakdown. So this can be multiple different things. This is super tailored to various different businesses, but if you're talking specifically in the planning phase, in the wedding planning phase, is specifically saying, hey, vendor delays are the data points that predict the next breakdown, because if vendors are delaying, then you ultimately vendors are the essential part of your pipeline, and if they're failing, then ultimately everything else fails, because you can't get people there on time, you can't get the planning moving, swift flowing. So ultimately just having that as well, and saying, hey, number 3, which is building the shield with tools, saying, hey, why this is key is tools turn data into action, because you need to be moving, and action also guides you, because the faster you're doing and the more things you're doing, your shields got to be automatic. So basically just using that data to build action, and saying, hey, what I'm actively doing is build Airtable automations to flag late vendors synced with Google Data Studio for real-time dashboards. So just basically plugging in tools that allow us to move with action, and saying, hey, we're actively building leverage, and we're actually leveraging data in order to build what it is that we're actively building on a day-to-day basis, which is the big lesson that have learned as well, which is leveraging data. So being able to leverage data as an anchor point, and also a guidance to what it is that we're doing, and also implementing new strategies, because data-backed strategies ultimately help us move more tactically, and also make sure that we're moving with the right key informations that we need, that we're not leaving no stone unturned as we're moving, but also just understanding that sometimes you may not get the data until you actually do more things, and ultimately just knowing that action also creates data. So also just building stuff, breaking stuff, making sure that we're moving more tactically into the future, and saying, hey, what is the first principles question that we can ask, which is, what's the core tool that you need to block chaos before it lands? Ultimately just asking, what is the tool that we need? Is it Airtable? Is it automations? Is it Zapier? Is it make.com? What are the tools that we need in our tool stack or tech stack in order to build a foundation that allows us to block chaos before it lands, and the anchor points as well by leveraging data. And then which ultimately leads us to the fourth point, which is testing the predictions. So basically running simulations, and ultimately just making sure that we're testing this out, and saying, hey, predictions are guesses until you prove them, so you need to test them out fast. So this is the same that I like to speak about in terms of our build process, where we essentially say, hey, we need to just build things as soon as possible, getting an MVP out and testing that MVP, because testing takes a lot of time, especially basically in terms of building custom software, what we have been figuring out and learning from is that the testing phase, you can build something, but the testing phase is going to take so much time, and with that you just need to be able to build and then perfect it later, and just make sure that you have something out that you can gather data from and also create action from. So saying, hey, how am I actively doing this is, like I said, running a test simulation of a planner system with predictive alerts. First test caught a vendor flake before it tanked the event, so making sure that on the top of the pipeline or the top of the food chain or the supply chain, we're making sure that we understand that we're flagging based on certain criteria, and if those criteria test to be true, then ultimately we're flagging it, and then we're taking action for that based on also past data and also present data as well, in order to use that to predict future data as well, and making sure that we have and are achieving a high level of accuracy, which is also super important. And then saying, hey, the biggest lesson that I've learned here is test small, win big, proves your leverage, ultimately leveraging proof that this actually works, ultimately just creates that leverage that we need in order to move with what it is that we're actively building. And saying, hey, how do you validate your chaos shield works? Ultimately just asking the first principles question. How do we validate it? We ultimately need to test it in order to validate, to make sure that it is working, which ultimately then leads to the final point, which is scaling it. And why this is key is this shield predicts chaos that scales to 100k months. So this is what we're actively planning for to be a core integral part of the business's infrastructure that allows them to scale past 100k months, because we want to build this system to be able to predict those kinds of problems and then ultimately just scale that into the future. And it then becomes a deal closer to say, hey, we're targeting to save 100k in terms of client chaos, and ultimately just building around that with that big vision goal, or that goal to say we want to build this, and this is the goal that we have to save. Hey, we want to save these in 100k months for our client base, and ultimately just build towards that. And saying, hey, how I'm actively doing this is pitched with predictive features. So hey, we're actively building this out, but we're just being transparent that, hey, this isn't fully functional yet, but this is how it could look like if it was fully functional. We just need to build it and integrate it into their current workflow and their process within the business. And then saying, hey, the biggest lesson that I've learned here is clients pay for peace, predicted and delivered. So people just want peace of mind. They just want to know that their operations are streamlined, that they have to wake up in the morning, just check their dashboard, make sure everything is running smoothly, and then they have peace of mind, and that is the number one thing to them. And then asking the first principles question of saying, hey, this first principles question basically sums up all the 5 points, which is what's the core chaos your clients fear that you can predict right away. So basically tying everything together in terms of using the predictive analysis, saying, hey, we're using the tools that we're using, we're also using the chains that we have been using, the data that we have been using from past to present, in order to guide us to make sure that we're making predictions that are accurate and also as achievable as possible, to make sure that we're actively achieving that, and also making sure that we're creating ROI within the business, and also tracking that, to making sure that, hey, the chaos that we're actively having that our clients fear, we're able to predict it and make sure and make sure we're able to stop it before it actually happens. And how we do this is basically by using data and actively implementing these different strategies that we have on the back end to make sure that we use their data in order to guide us, but not only data, but specific frameworks and strategies that we can then scale up into the future. And this is basically my take on it. I may be wrong into the future, but this is what we're actively doing right now, and it works. So it works for us. So with this framework works for us for sure. So basically just going to be tweaking this, just making sure that we're actively just iterating on this. This is day 20, 28, 29, 28, 28, 27, 27. So yeah, so this is just basically our take on it, and we're still just going to be refining this. Like I said, we are still in the trenches, we're still figuring things out, we're still building on top of this predictive chaos analysis tool that we're building on, and we're only just going to scale it up into the future. So this is our current take on it. We're solely just going to use this to build better, iterate better, and to build better products that we can roll out into the market and for our client base, and just ultimately just improve our service delivery and streamline our processes even further with building better mental models by implementing these different strategies and frameworks that I'm actively thinking about and also trying to implement into our daily plays. So if you guys do enjoy this video, make sure to connect with me on X, subscribe on YouTube, and make sure to leave a comment and let me know what your guys' thoughts are. And also don't forget to check me out on Instagram. So I'll see you guys in the next video.